Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Whenever I'm about to do something, I think, would an idiot do that? And if they would, I do not do that thing.
Thank you for joining us for the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're looking forward to another interview today. Today, it's with Andy Bannister, who's a Christian speaker and teacher. Today, we'll be talking to Andy about his forthcoming book, How to Share Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. And that's being released in August 2023. Very enjoyable read. What do you think, Chad?
Well, I have to say that the content was outstanding. This is definitely be at the top of my list of books on evangelism, how to share your faith. But man, it was funny. I don't remember reading a evangelism / apologetics book and laughing out loud so many times. There were even a few times where I was sitting and reading it and I would start laughing and I would have to share it with the family member who was sitting nearest me. It was not only super informative, very helpful, but also hilarious.
Yes, I LOL'd out loud multiple times. And it was interesting you get this window into his family life and obviously having young kids in the house, and because there's so many jokes about dinosaurs in the salad bowl and things like that. And
Yes.
it was hilarious, and it really kept my interest on that point. But the content was really great. Probably my number one recommended evangelism, just pure evangelism with a sprinkling of apologetics in there as well. So sort of a bit of a tactical approach, practical, down to earth, and fun and engaging book. So highly recommended. And we'll be talking to Andy about that today. That's How to Share Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. Obviously, you can get that at various booksellers, but we'll leave a link to the Amazon pre-order page and you can pick that up. Now, Dr. Andy Bannister is the director of the SOLAS Center for Public Christianity, speaking and teaching regularly throughout the UK, Europe, Canada, the USA, and the wider world. He holds a PhD in Islamic studies and has taught extensively at universities across Canada, the USA, and UK, and further afield on both Islam and philosophy. He's also an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffrey Center for the Study of Islam at Melbourne School of Theology, and is also adjunct faculty at Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. So he's like all over the map. We're going to find out a little bit more about his journey today. We hope you'll enjoy this interview today. You can find Andy's website at andybannister.net and find out more about SOLAS at solas-cpc.org.
And Brian, if I'm correct, the pre-reboot podcast, you have interviewed him 2 other times. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Andy and I go way back.
So you guys are buds.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, Andy Bannister, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's great to be here, Brian's 3rd time. So hopefully I'll get it right this time, eh?
It feels like deja vu.
It does feel like deja vu. Absolutely. Absolutely. Although last time you didn't have the beard. So that's a clue something's changed.
Yes. Well, we were talking earlier about how we've enjoyed your book. We've laughed a lot in reading it.
Andy, I found your book. I was talking to Brian and I was reflecting back and trying to remember if I've ever laughed as much when I was reading a book on evangelism with apologetics peppered through. And I don't think I have. I so appreciated not only the content, which I think people are going to find tremendously helpful, but I also just so appreciated the humor. And also as a dad, I could relate to so much of the humor. And so I just wanted to say I found myself laughing quite a bit while I was reading it, to the point where there were a few times where I was sitting in my living room reading it and I would start laughing, and whichever family member was sitting nearest to me, I'd have to say, listen to this, and I would read it to them.
Well, that's a win. And actually, thank you. Firstly, thank you. That's very kind of you. And then just very quickly, for folks, I mean, that's a very serious decision, because one of my concerns writing this book was there's loads of books on evangelism and apologetics, but the problem is people who really need to read them don't read them. So, we always sort of pre-select. And I wanted to write a book on evangelism for people who don't think evangelism is for them don't think they can do it, and are not going to pick up a book with that on the cover. That's actually, by the way, the reason we don't even use the word evangelism until the end of the first chapter. We don't drop the E word. And it's also why we use the humor, because I think if you can get people laughing and chuckling, then defenses go down. And in fact, my first book on atheism went this route in terms of evangelism and getting folks who are not open to the faith laughing, and then hopefully truth can come through. And this hopefully does the same trick with Christians to go, okay, all right, I'm now willing to perhaps think about evangelism, because that was actually not a bad one-liner.
Yeah, it seems to be the way to go. I've found when I'm talking to audiences that don't know anything about apologetics is I won't even say the word, just use every other variation in order to keep people's guard down. And yeah, I think you accomplish that really well with evangelism, sharing your faith, or talking about Jesus without sounding like an idiot. Now, I want to ask you where you are, so everybody knows, because you've been in Canada, you've been in the US, you've been in the UK. Where in the UK? Some people don't even know what the UK means. Is that a nation? So talk about where your journey has brought you.
That's a great question. Well, the UK is currently still a nation. If certain nationalist groups in certain far-flung parts of the scepter Isle have their way, it may not remain one. But it is for now. It's the mother of civilization, as Chad, as an American, will be the first to recognize.
Of course.
Make America Great Britain again. That's my motto. And you're right. I was for 6 years in Canada, in Toronto. Then we came back from there in 2016 and moved to Dundee, which is in Scotland. So if you look at a map of the UK, the top of the map is Scotland, and the sort of top right-hand side is Dundee, just about an hour north of Edinburgh. And we went there to take over the leadership of a small evangelism and apologetics, to use that word, ministry called SOLAS. SOLAS is the Scots word, the Gaelic word for light. So we like that kind of imagery. But then about a year ago, Brian, we actually moved back down from Scotland into England. SOLAS's impact was growing across the whole of the UK. We were getting more and more speaking invites down to the south. Originally, we thought we'd hire a speaker down here, but actually for family reasons, it was really convenient for us to move. We've got elderly parents and all at this end of the country. So we actually made the move, and we are hiring another speaker for the Scottish team. So I am based in a place that actually many people in England haven't heard of, actually, Swindon, which is about 90 minutes sort of west-southwest of London in the county of Wiltshire, where the sun always shines. And it's a great place, actually, because you can reach the whole of the UK from here fairly easily. But I get back across the pond quite regularly just to make sure our American cousins are still behaving themselves.
Well, just tell us a bit about the SOLAS Center for Public Christianity, and what do you do? What's the goal? You mentioned speakers and outreach, but tell a little bit more about that.
Well, the first thing I'd say, actually, Brian, since you and I last bumped into each other, we've actually shortened the name, because we decided it would be great to go for a name that you don't need to take 2 breaths to get through. So we have contracted SOLAS Center for Public Christianity to just SOLAS. And the nice thing about that, and actually it's an interesting point here about evangelism, right? Intriguing people can be interesting. So I found if people who hadn't got a faith asked me, what do you do? And I said, I work for an organization called the SOLAS Center for Public Christianity. Sometimes that could cause all kinds of barriers straight away, because people there were words in there that people brought their own understanding to. So if I say I work for an organization called SOLAS, people then say, what does that do? And that's lovely, because then you can describe it any which way you like. And so what we do is 2 things, really. Is that the first thing we do, we love taking the message of Jesus, the gospel, out of the 4 walls of churches and into the public square. So we work with churches and university groups and others to put on low-key evangelism events in places like universities, schools, colleges, workplaces, cafes, pubs, restaurants, those kind of neutral third spaces. And we do a lot of that with a lot of sort of what we call pre-evangelism. So we put on events where we'll take a topic that engages people, often encourage the organizers to provide food and hospitality. I wanted the team to do a short talk, Q&A, and we find that's really effective, actually. We live in an age where people are not closed to spirituality, and they're interested. So yeah, what we might call apologetics, we just wouldn't use that word. And then the other half of what we do is we teach and train Christians how to share their faith with their friends, colleagues, mates, classmates, and so on. And a lot of that, again, what you might traditionally, call apologetics, but also a lot of very practical stuff, actually, because we find a lot of the time it's just teaching folks how to have normal conversations, how to take an interest, how to ask good questions, how to listen well, how not to look like an idiot. And then we have a lot, and we back that up. We do most of that in person, but then we have a website and we do lots of digital content to support that. So we're a small organization. There's only 8 of us, and I'm the only full-timer. So we do a lot with a small team and a small budget, and it's great fun.
Yeah. Well, a lot of great resources on the website as well. So we'll make sure to link those in the show notes so people can find them.
That's very kind. The check's in the mail.
Oh, super. Thanks.
We could always use it.
$1.50. Don't spend it all at once.
Yeah. So your book, the title, my wife, of course, she asked me, who are you interviewing next on the podcast? And I told her this guy, Andy Bannister, he's from the UK. And I said the title of the book, how to share Jesus without sounding like an idiot. And immediately she laughed and said, that's a great title. And there was somebody else who I can't recall who also loved the title. So tell us a little bit about why you chose to call it that.
Well, the great thing is, and I can say this, wholeheartedly as an author without any sort of hint of sort of getting full of oneself, I think it's a brilliant title because I didn't wholly come up with it. So it goes back to when I was in Canada. I forget the exact date. I should know because I talk about it in the acknowledgements in the book, actually. About 10 years ago, I was doing speaking at a missions conference in, I think it was Manitoba, Winnipeg, I think it was. And I was doing a session on practical evangelism. And so with the organizing committee, I was on the phone. This was before Zoom was a thing. And we were brainstorming titles. And somehow between us, and I don't think it was largely me, we came up with, I think, something like really boring, like practical tools showing your faith. And they were like, that's really dull. And anyway, after it was a 10-minute brainstorm with 5 of us, and that was the session title we came up with. And afterwards, I sort of then added that to my repertoire of talks. And then I was finding wherever I was going and speaking, and that was on the menu of talks, people picked that one. And just like you said, people went, it's a brilliant title. And then I had folks telling me, well, you should write a book on that. And so I thought, yeah, great idea. But then I kind of parked that because I wrote the book on atheism, responding to the new atheism back in 2014, 2015. Last book was the Muslim book, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? When that was done, I thought, okay, finally the time has come to take the idiot book off the fun thing is, by the way, my 10-year-old daughter who's just wandered through the room on her way up to bed has this sort of I picked up this habit now of saying, Dad, you always write books that have a one-word answer. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? No. How to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot? Don't. And
yeah, I like that.
But yeah, that's where it came from. It came out of a group of us in Canada for a missions conference, and I think what I like about it, it's interesting. More seriously, Chad, to us, why does it work? Because that's the secret fear. You can dress it up with posh kind of language, but actually deep down, most Christians, or certainly many, many, many Christians, are afraid they are going to look like an idiot if they try and talk about their faith, because they'll get laughed at, they'll say something stupid, they won't know what to say. That is the crippling fear. So why not just name it? Why not just name it on the tin and try and hopefully address it?
Yeah, I absolutely love the title.
Yeah, well, the fear aspect, you kind of took the word out of my mouth as I was kind of thinking about that. Like, we are crippled if we are thinking, well, I don't know what to say, I don't know where to start, I don't know how I'll sound, and it becomes a self-conscious thing where I'll just wait until the perfect thing comes up. And so there's that fear of starting, and then there's a fear of waiting too long, of, well, how do I talk to someone if I haven't talked to them yet and I know them very well? So what do you think is like the first way to deal with that? I mean, you talk about naming it, but how do you get over the fear?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, I think I talk about this in the book fairly early on. The naming it is important. Actually, I think naming the big fear and then breaking it down and going, okay, what specifically is it? Do I think I might look like an idiot because I'm afraid I'll be asked a question I don't know an answer to? Do I think I'll look like an idiot because I'll stand out and look different? Do I look like an idiot because I'm afraid if I mention my faith in the workplace, there's all these perceptions that people have of Christians that will get thrown at me? So I think actually trying to identify what the actual fear is. In fact, the analogy I use in the book is I was terrified of flying for a long, long time. Almost wouldn't get on a plane if people of our generations remember the A-Team. I was B.A. Baracus, just like smaller and not as muscular. And,
you still have the gold chains, though. I see.
Yes.
Yeah, should do have the gold chain. He actually, and of course, he's a committed Christian, which is interesting. If you look at his Twitter, he is pretty bold and fearless.
Yes,
which is
he's
amazing.
very bold on Twitter. Yeah,
he's very bold on Twitter and very clear about his faith. But the point being is, it was only when a pilot friend helped me to actually name them. They go, okay, what is it you were afraid of? You know, well, I was afraid the wings might fall off. It sounds stupid. She was like, well, it's not stupid. Let's talk about that. Let's explore why that's not going to happen. And so I think naming the fears is a great place to start, Brian. The next thing I think can be helpful, and this is again where I think apologetics can go a bit wrong sometimes, is try and find examples of people who are more like you who are sharing their faith. So one of the things we do in the book, one of the sort of the early transition chapters into the practical stuff, I tell the story of 7 or 8 different friends who are just ordinary people sharing their faith in different ways. There's lots of great websites out there that will do this. We do this on the SOLAS website. Actually, we've got a series on the SOLAS website called Frontlines, where we talk, where a year or so ago we ran this, and every 2 weeks we interviewed another Christian in another place type of work who is sharing their faith naturally. Because the danger otherwise is we look at the big guys and girls. You know, we look at the John Lennoxes or the Amy Orr Ewings or the Rebecca McLaughlins or the Tim Kellers, and we go, oh, these men and women are absolute geniuses. I couldn't do what they do. And you're dead right. You can't do what the majority of us can't do what they do. A few of us can, and God may be calling you to that. But I think aim lower. I don't like the word lower. That implies they're on a pedestal somewhere. Mm-hmm. Try and find people just like you. So one thing we talk about in the book, for example, look around your church. Are there people who you look in your church and go, oh, they're quite good at sharing their faith? Well, get to know them, find out what they're doing, to pick their brains, you know, learn from people a bit more like you. That can give you confidence. So those are some of the practical things before we get into some of the tools you can use. So yeah, name the fears and try and find some role models who are a little bit more like you rather than the superstars.
Yeah, one of the things you brought up that I thought was really intriguing that got me thinking quite a bit in the book was the idea that these fears or reluctances that we have to share our faith, in a sense, reveal our idols.
Oh, yes.
And can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it was tough to write about because I wanted to be a really encouraging book, not a kind of beat people around the head book. Because I don't know about you, I've read books on, I remember when I was younger reading books on evangelism. Actually, the 2 books I found that did this were books on evangelism and books on prayer could do this, where they would just guilt you
yes.
into going, you know, into praying more, evangelizing more. And I didn't want to be that kind of book. So the nearest we ever go to anything that way is exactly that point of saying, look, yeah, your fears can reveal your idols. I actually got that from Keller, I think. His book, The Prodigal God, plays with this. So, for example, you know, if you're afraid of losing your job, then it may be that money and the standard of living is your idol. It's what you're really living for. And that fear reveals that. You know, if you're afraid about losing a loved one, then that's, you know, no, it's not good losing a loved one. But if that's a crippling fear, then again, maybe that relationship has become an idol. And so the fear we have of losing something if sometimes can show us that that's become the center rather than God. And so I just talk in the book a little bit about if our fear is, say, our reputation in the workplace, let's just be careful that workplace reputation hasn't become our idol. That what we really want is a comfortable life where people think well of us and we fit in and we're part of the social crowd. And that's what really matters to us. Because if that is the case, that's obviously going to be a handicap when it comes to evangelism. Because it may be the case that if you talk about faith in the workplace, it may cost you a little bit of reputation. You know, it may have some, hopefully, if you do it well and winsomely, not disastrously so, but there's obviously a small risk. And Jesus didn't say, take up your cross and carry me. So yeah, I do think when we run across a fear around anything to do with our faith, to prayerfully bring that to the Lord and go, okay, is there an idol here? And the great thing is, there's obviously, you know, as we know, there's forgiveness and restoration in Christ. Christ doesn't condemn us for that. I think, you know, it's a healthy thing to do, to bring that before him and say, okay, Lord, help me with that.
Amen. You
talk about the tools that you explore in the book. Can you kind of just give us an overview of, you know, I want people to you know, buy the book and read it. And I'm sure maybe you do too, but give them an idea of like sort of your overview. Like, what are we getting here? What do you sort of provide me? What tool set are we looking at?
Great question. So the big, in fact, it's good that there's a question, because that's a natural segue, right? Because the big thing at the center of the book, and this is not new to me, but hopefully the way it's packaged is a lot more accessible than perhaps others have done it, is the power of asking questions, right? And this comes out of the fact that when you look at the Gospels, Jesus asks over 300 questions. I think it's 307 or 308. I forget the exact stat. One of those numbers, questions in the Gospels. He's asked like 83 and he only answers 8 directly. He tends to answer questions with questions. And when you look in the Gospels, and we do this again in the book, is take a really good deep look at how Jesus does it, you see that questions are the heart of what he does. And I think questions are really effective, Brian, for a whole number of reasons. Firstly, they're quite non-threatening, as the first thing. Rather than having to go out armed with all kinds of information, start with taking an interest in others. And one of the examples I give in the book is, if you've got someone in your workplace who has a different faith to you, don't feel you need to become an expert in Islam to outreach to witness to Muslims. What about inviting a colleague out for lunch and saying, hey, forgive me for asking, but I understand you're a Muslim? And they'll probably say yes if you're polite and say, I really don't know anything about Islam. Would you tell me a bit about what you believe? Just ask lots of questions. Keep topping the coffee up. And eventually there'll be a very natural opportunity for you to say, hey, this is fascinating. I'm a Christian. And so this is great. We have some things in common. And we also have some things that are different. And probably because you've listened to your friend is likely to go, oh, what? So what do you believe that's different? And you're away. Very natural. So questions can be really helpful that way. I think questions can also dig behind issues, because often in apologetics and evangelism, I'm sure you chaps have discovered this, the presenting issue is not the real issue. So the question that somebody asks or the objection somebody raises is not the real one. There's something underneath that's going on. And if we can learn to lead with questions. So, again, just very simple. If someone sort of raises an objection to your faith, if someone says, well, hang on, you're a Christian. Well, how can you be a Christian if, whatever they raise, before you leap in with your size 10s, even if you know the answer, it can be so more effective to say, that's a really good question. Tell me, why do you ask it? And you may well get a bit personal story. So questions are really effective. And then, Brian, what we do in the book is teach 4 questions. It's really a toolkit of 4 questions that we teach people to ask, which all beginning with W, because I like alliteration being a Baptist. There's the what question, the why question, the wonder question, and the whether question. And then there's other stuff kind of built around that. And the other thing I think in the book that I think people will hopefully find really helpful too, we also teach a 5-step approach you can apply to answering any tough question. Because I think one of the other weaknesses with evangelism can come if you've mastered all kinds of topics X, Y, and Z, or Z for our American cousins. What happens if someone asks you question K? And so again, the book hopefully tries to teach some tools to help you at least get your teeth into any question, even if you've never heard it before. But questions is the heart of this. Mm-hmm. And what I found exciting about this book is based on teaching, I don't know, tens of thousands, probably even over 100,000 now. People have been in sessions where I've taught this live. And the feedback we get consistently is when people get this idea of learning to ask questions, it's transformative. So I taught some material in this book at a big conference in the UK a few weeks ago, actually, called Word Alive, which is a big Christian conference up in Wales. I had 500 people for 4 1.5 hour sessions. And I got an email the week after from somebody who said literally the day after the conference ended, she'd gone to work and was able to use what she'd learned in the 4 mornings before there in the workplace. It's amazing. It just works. And I go, it does, doesn't it? So it's not, I've always been very clear. I'm not the first to have thought about this. You can look at, the one of my heroes is a guy called Randy Newman, American based. You may have come across Randy. His book, Questioning Evangelism, utterly brilliant. Greg Kokel's book, Tactics, would be another. But I think they both suffer from that. If you're a bit scared about evangelism, they're too scary. And so I recommend them in the book as a next step you might want to go to. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping my book will be a gateway drug to some of this other stuff too.
When just a follow up there, Andy, sometimes when I'm listening to someone's answer, I think, okay, what would someone who's really like scared of this, what might their response be? And maybe it would be something like, well, that's easy for you because you do this all the time, and so it's natural for you. Would you tell that person, well, listen, you need to actually think ahead about who you're going to see today. You have to plan these things. Like, what should they have? Oh, next time I talk to this person, I'm going to have this question ready. What sort of tips would you give people to prepare?
Yeah. Well, in terms of prepping, the first thing I would say that sometimes gets missed in some of the sort of apologetic stuff, because those of us into apologetics love the arguments, right? We're creatures of the mind. And there's nothing wrong with that. God's made us that way. But the thing that can sometimes get overlooked if we're not careful is prayer. So I would start with prayer. You can be praying. You could be making a list of people to be praying regularly for, and that's can be transformative actually. If you make a list of 5 or 6 colleagues, friends, people you see regularly, be praying for them day in, day out, as often as you can remember. That can be really helpful. You can be, if you can be praying for opportunities to speak to them, or if you're going to be seeing them, pray into that. And also on the back end of it, you can pray afterwards. So that's good preparation. I think another good piece of preparation is if it's someone Brian, and you perhaps have chatted with before, or it's someone you know well enough that you know a bit about them, and you've got an idea of what might be the issues or the stumbling blocks, you can do some preparation. And that can be helpful, right? Because as you know, apologetics is a massive field. So if you are going to go deeper, where do you go deep? I often get asked that, and I'll always say, well, let the people around you guide what you're studying. I mean, the reason I became an expert in Islamic studies as my academic background is it was Muslims I was talking to all the time. If I'd been talking all the time to Hindus, I'd have probably done a PhD in Hinduism. I guess I let the people you're talking, liaising with, guide you to some extent. And then I think the other big thing is take the pressure off a bit as well. Don't feel you've got to go the whole 9 yards in every conversation. Be willing to particularly if it's people you see regularly, colleagues, friends, neighbors, be willing to just go gently a little bit. And don't be afraid too, if you're talking with a friend, if you don't know the answer, of saying, that's a really good question you've raised. And I confess I don't fully know the answer, but look, if that really matters to you, I will go and do some digging and find the answer. Would you like me to think more about that for you? Because that shows honor and you're respecting them. And again, you're letting the questions they're asking guide the conversation. But yeah, I think sometimes we can, the fear of the what if, if I talk to that person and what if this happens, can be a huge problem. And I think trying to get past that and normalizing things too, and that's why the language of conversation features so much of the book. Rather than think about I'm doing evangelism or I'm doing apologetics, think about I'm having a conversation with my friend, with my neighbor, with my colleague, about things I care about, and conversations don't need to be scary.
Very good.
That's good stuff. So we've talked about asking great questions and how to overcome fear. And one of the things I'm sitting here wondering is, what are some pitfalls that you would encourage Christians to avoid when they're sharing their faith? Perhaps maybe some habits that you see that you think, I really wish they wouldn't do that. Are there some things that stick out? This could be, face-to-face evangelism, online evangelism. What do you think of that?
Oh gosh, you mentioned online evangelism. There's a whole veritable dead marshes of pitfalls there for little Lord of the Rings. Yeah, well, let's start there, because that's how I can do an easy win there, where I've seen things and I go, oh gosh. I think online, 2 things to avoid online. First is trying to do too much online. I mean, Twitter is famous for this. You cannot have a sensible conversation on Twitter. So almost don't get into arguments. I watch young apologists particularly go off on, fighting the good fight with atheists online. And I'm like, I think more heat than light is being generated, quite frankly, half the time. So I think know the limits of what you can do. But then the broader thing I also see a lot on social media that I worries me slightly is make sure that your social media profile and your page, whatever, your feed, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, show my age because I didn't mention TikTok, but whatever it is you're doing, make sure your profile and your page and your feed looks relatively normal. I think there are 2 mistakes Christians make, particularly say on Facebook, which is more of my generation, is you go on to some people's sort of pages and either they say nothing about their Christian faith, so they've become an undercover Christian online and hidden the fact they've got any faith, or more commonly, they fill their feed up with really cheesy Christian content, Christian conspiracy theories, real conspiracy theories, how Bill Gates causes hair loss in hamsters or whatever it is, and my concern is, I remember noticing I would see things where I'd go on friends' feeds and they would have 2 or 3 really quite out there things they were busy banging on about. In the middle of them, they'd post a video on evidence for the resurrection. And if your non-Christian friend looks at your feed, and what they'll do is they'll simply assume that the evidence for the resurrection is the same with these other pet conspiracy theories that you're banging on about. So, without, causing angry letters to be written in crayon, I'm not going to pick any particular conspiracy theories, but people listening to this may know who you are. Just look at your social media feed with a view of an outsider, or better still, if you've got a non-Christian friend that you really trust, ask them. Just ask someone you trust to go, do I look like a wacko? So that's the first thing. And then in person, just to a couple of thoughts there, Chad. I think similar things applies. Don't be weird. Christians sometimes get a reputation for being a bit odd and weird to talk with. So just be relatively normal. Take an interest in people. Learn to talk normally about, the movies that you've watched, the sport that you've played, your families, and those kind of things. And then weave conversations about faith into that regime, that routine of normal conversation. If your work colleagues know that every time they talk to you, you're going to be asking whether they found Jesus and quoting Bible verses at them, they're going to find that quite difficult. Try and be someone who's normal and fun to hang out with and takes an interest in people and weaves your faith unapologetically into that, can be the first thing. And then the second thing I think Christians can be guilty of, again, perhaps especially those of us who like the more argumentative sort of apologetic stuff, is talking too much. Mm-hmm. I've often thought a good rule of thumb when you're talking to someone who's not a Christian, perhaps think about letting them do at least 60% of the talking, more than 50%. And that's where questions can be helpful, because you're forcing them almost actually to do more of the talking. And then make sure the words that you do contribute, bring real weight and gravity. Because the danger is, again, because I'm just conscious this is an apologetics podcast, right? You're talking to a friend, they mention a question or an issue, and you're like, oh, I know this one. Oh. And then suddenly you're giving them a 5-minute download where they don't want a 5-minute download. They want a conversation. So don't talk too much. Don't be weird. Don't be an idiot.
I like that. Yeah, I freely admit that there are sometimes I'm in conversations and a topic will come up that I particularly find interesting, or that I might know a little bit about, and I will I almost go into this mode of, man, if I just throw enough content at this person, something's got to stick. And then later on, I think, why did I do that? Like, it would have been much more effective to just ask a few questions or to challenge something maybe they said instead of me. And at some point you tune someone out as well.
You do, don't you?
Yeah. And so.
And by the way, just on that very point, if anyone's listening to this and thinking, yes, but, this goes right back to Jesus, right? One of the examples I use in the book, the story of Jesus and the rich young ruler, the guy who comes to Jesus and says, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus, answer really boils down to, remember, he says to him, well, why do you call me good? Only God is good. Mm-hmm. And throws this zinger of a question at him. I mean, Jesus could have given a whole parable. He could have given a whole sermon. He could have Sermon on the Mounted the guy, but he is quite content to respond with a comment and a question and go, it was good enough for Jesus, maybe for us, not all the time, but a good chunk of the time, to be just raising questions. And by the way, the fourth question I teach in the book, the weather question, that really hangs on when you are going to teach or share truth with a friend, couching it as a question, rather than saying, I think it's the case that. It can be actually more receptive. People are more open if you say, I wonder, have you considered whether it could be the case that, and then you share what you're offering, because that comes across as much less dogmatic. You're not compromising. You're in fact inviting them in and saying, hey, what do you think about the possibility that? And you can often find people who might, sort of pull up the drawbridge when you try and come straight through the door, are more receptive if you phrase it as a question. So I think there's something about human nature, actually. We respond better to questions and people inviting us to consider what we think. And again, you're in gospel territory. Come and see. I love that invitation in John 1 that's made. Jesus, come and see, and then that Philip makes to Nathaniel, come and see. Invite people to take a look.
So it seems like I'm seeing it when you're talking there, Andy. I'm like, there's this aspect of being self-conscious that can keep us in fear and prevent us from even starting to share our faith. But then there's this aspect when we do share our faith, if we're not self-aware, then we can fall into pitfalls. So maybe this knowing how you're coming across being aware when you're maybe pushing too hard or talking too much or things like that. And I kind of like that aspect there too, when you talk about these weather questions, not like, hey, how's the weather? But
how's the weather?
I wonder whether...
That's a dad joke, mate. That was a dad joke.
So, questions over claims in the sense of, well, instead of making a claim, why don't you couch it in a question? Yeah. That's great. What about someone might say, well, hey, there was this great quote I heard from Francis Assisi where, I should just... preach the gospel and if necessary, use words.
Use words.
Do you have any thoughts on that? I know.
Yes,
I
funny you mentioned that. Yes, exactly. It's almost like you set the one up. I referred to that in the book, and I think one reason I referred to that in the book, Brian, is sometimes that can be that's part of a bigger conversation about for those of us who are nervous about sharing our faith. Sometimes the sort of hideout that we can run for, the bunker we can run for, is the be a nice person kind of bunker. So we think to ourselves, well, if I'm just a nice person at work, if I'm just super friendly and super charming and serve my colleagues well, I make coffee for everyone, wash up everyone's coffee cups, go the extra mile, always work hard, or if around family, I'm always super nice. People will look at my niceness and assume I'm a Christian and assume it's about Jesus. And we miss the fact that actually they'll probably just assume you're a nice person. But the sort of direct line for that, it goes back to Assisi, who is alleged to have said, as you quoted there. The thing is, that quote, like many things you read on the internet, is made up. I think, similar to the Albert Einstein quote, don't believe anything you read on the internet. And
that was Gandalf.
Was it Gandalf?
Yeah.
Maybe Gandalf. You're absolutely right. And I think, by the way, the foolishness of it is when you go digging, you discover that actually Francis of Assisi was quite a bold preacher. He would walk into these great society sort of dinners of his day and parties and things and stand in the middle and preach and challenge the rich of his day, not just with the gospel, with how they were living. So he could actually be quite confrontational. He was not afraid of polemics and really being quite bold. So this idea that he was this sort of little figure who went around cuddling squirrels and never saying anything is I think is a bit of a travesty kind of thing. So if you want to cuddle squirrels, that's your thing, but it sounds nuts to me. And anyway, so that's a myth. So anyone who tells you just be nice, Francis of Assisi said it, you can gently say, can you tell me where did he say it?
Wow, we go from Gandalf to Radagast the Brown there, so that was a big...
Oh my word, we're going deep on the Tolkien nerdiness now, aren't we?
Yes.
Oh man. Well, one of the things I love in the book too is how you talk about bringing our conversations back to Jesus. And you have this little handout in the back of the book that
cut out and keep guide.
They can cut it out or rip it out, I guess, whatever they want to do with it. Laminate it. Yeah, I forgot about that.
A device for killing baby sheep, the laminator.
What? So, anyway, I'm going to get this out.
Go on, man. Get it out, Chad.
So you also have some really great sentence starters about how to bring the conversation back to Jesus. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about those? Because I love that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and the first thing, by the way, the rationale behind that is, again, I noticed that sometimes, again, perhaps for those of us who love our apologetics a lot, you can have arguments and great philosophical discussions, but you forget to connect it to Jesus. Mm-hmm. I remember one of my friends years ago, who's sort of older and wiser in this business, sort of saying that any conversation that doesn't either begin or end with Jesus probably doesn't deserve the title Christian in terms of apologetics. And so, we want to engage people's questions and do all that kind of stuff, but we want to obviously land it at Jesus. And so in the book, I use three, not thought questions, but three little connectors that you can be in a conversation with, prayerfully looking for an opportunity to use. And they're very simply, you can look for a chance to say, well, that reminds me of something that Jesus said. This conversation reminds me of something that Jesus did. Or this reminds me of a story that Jesus told. And, I've used those on numerous occasions. I tell the story in the book, and it's fresh in my mind because I preached on this morning and used the same story of a university student that I was chatting to about a year or two ago, a university mission that a colleague and I were speaking at. And afterwards got talking to this girl who'd come. and she sort of said words to the effect that she was quite intrigued by Jesus, found Jesus quite an attractive figure, actually, but was totally put off Christianity. How could you take Christianity seriously when you look at all the examples of Christian leaders who abused their power for financial or sexual gain? The newspapers seem full of this day in, day out. So how could I take Christianity or the church seriously? I mean, that is a darn good it's a darn good question. And, my first thought as apologist was to go into, well, let me just try and answer that. But actually, that doesn't need an answer in one sense. What it needs is somebody to see past the crap, pardon my directness, and get connected to Jesus. And so that was where I took that approach. And I said, well, I share your utter disgust at those stories because they're so antithetical to how Jesus behaved. And in fact, that this conversation, your very question, reminds me of something Jesus once did. I said, have you heard the story of when Jesus washed his disciples' feet? And she hadn't. And so my colleague said, well, would you mind if we read that to you? And she said, yeah, sure. So he pulled open, John's Gospel and read that story. And then we got to talk a bit about servant leadership and how countercultural that was. You could see she was totally receptive, no pushback. She was really interested in this. And then at the end of that segment, I was able to again say, well, another thing that Jesus did that this conversation reminds me of course, is his death on the cross, because here's somebody with supreme power, God's own son, who could have, done anything he wanted, but used his power not to victimize others, but became a victim. And it was an amazing conversation. And we actually ended up being able to give her a Bible, a New Testament, at the end of that conversation. And we hadn't used arguments or trying to defend the church or any kind of sort of clever, shenanigans. We literally just ran two versions of this reminds me of something Jesus thing. And then that led naturally into the Bible. So it's a great little segue. And again, I think the art is, again, using these things as tools. You don't use them as formulae. You don't just parrot that, so robotically. Look for that opportunity when you sense the Spirit is giving you that nudge that this is the time we want to bring Jesus into the convo.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent because ultimately that's who we want them to deal with him, right? And so I love any opportunity to be able to point people to him in that tactful way.
Yeah, it's also a reminder as well. I mean, because, I've made a few comments about the podcast about apologetics, and, Brian knows me well. I mean, I love apologetics. It's such a good tool and a resource. But I think for those of us who use it and use it a lot, the Jesus thing is also a reminder that apologetics is designed to really clear objections and obstructions so people can see Jesus clearly. And then you put it to one side. Once the time comes where it's not needed, don't use it. The Kalam cosmological argument is a wonderful thing, but it has its place. And sometimes that place is back in the toolbox, kind of thing. And so, so always have in mind that my job through through prayer and the power of the Spirit and the conversation we're having is to get to the point where I can connect someone to Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a nice note to start to wrap up our podcast. We've got just a couple minutes, but imagine someone's listening to this on their Monday morning, and they have two options. They can kind of be like, well, that was an interesting interview, and then nothing really changes. Hopefully they would, pre-order the book. That would be one great thing. But how could they put this into practice today? Like, it's the beginning of their day. You mentioned, praying, asking God. In the book, you talk about prayer being the first step, where you're asking God, Lord, just give me opportunities to speak to so-and-so, or help me to be open to, these opportunities. But what's one way they could just put this into practice without, just going back to whatever they're doing?
Yeah. I would say three very simple things that you could do even without reading the book. Although, why would you not read the book? But three very simple things you could do. Prayer, but two particular prayers, I would say, Brian. One is, I mentioned earlier in the show, make a list of 3, 4, or 5, maybe no more than 5, names of non-Christian friends, family members, people you're going to see on a relatively regular basis, colleagues, whatever, and put those somewhere where you're going to see them and remember them. Front of the Bible, stick them to the fridge or the cat or something, so you see them in first thing in the morning, and then be praying around for opportunities to engage with those people. So you're praying for them, praying for opportunities. So two prayer things you can do. Third thing you can do, that's a really easy way, I think, to be laying the groundwork for evangelism while you wait for the pre-ordered copy of How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot to arrive in the mail.
Exactly.
Hospitality. We haven't talked much about that, but that is a very overlooked evangelism tool. We often try and look for very clever things and whatnot, but just look for ways to practice hospitality. Invite a neighbor around for a meal, invite a colleague out for a coffee. Do something like that, because creating those create spaces, and food is a natural precursor to conversation. So even if you're very, very timid, go, is there someone you could invite round for a meal? And at that meal, or over that coffee, over that sandwich, take an interest, find out about them. And the more interest you show in them, most likely, unless you've invited a sociopath out for a meal, they're going to, take an interest in you. And there's an opportunity there to be bold and pray as you head into that meal to go, Lord, when they ask me about me, give me the boldness and the opportunity to find a way to talk naturally about my faith as part of it. So yeah, prayer and hospitality, two things you can do without knowing a single thing more about, conversational tools or apologetics or whatever. God can work through those very simple things very practically.
Wonderful. Well, Andy Bannister, thank you so much for joining us again. And for those listening, check the show notes for links to both the pre-order places for the book and for great resources from SOLAS and Andy's page at andybannister.net. So thank you again, Andy, and wishing you all the best.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chad. It's been a pleasure as always.
Yes, it was great to meet you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.